for our previous meeting, and they will be available on the website for everyone to view.
Sorry,
Next.
Rishi, hopping in really quick. It actually has to be a roll call vote to formally adopt them.
Thank you, Caroline. You just reminded me of that again, even though I just announced it. Thank you. Let me go down the list again. So Kalila Barnett, please.
I was planning to abstain from voting because I was not present at the meeting.
Thank you. All right, Madeline Fraser Cook.
I accept the minutes as written.
Okay, Melissa,
Yes. Yes.
Cheryl. You would also abstain.
not present.
Caroline.
Yes.
Thanks. Namrata.
Yes.
Lydia. You just seconded it. Marco.
Yes.
Yes.
Peter.
Yes.
Pat.
Yes.
And Ari.
Here, here.
Thanks so much, Caroline. Glad you're here to be my conscience about these things. Okay. So moving on to the next agenda item, I have a few announcements to make. The EJ maps, which are available on our website, will soon be updated with final census 2020 numbers next month in October. What's been appearing on the environmental justice maps since June of 2021 is a draft data that the US Census released as a preliminary matter because the accuracy of that census was affected by COVID lockdowns. Now the EJ Maps viewer will be updated with the final numbers released by the federal government for the 2020 census. We are still working out how to incorporate some of these changes. So please note that although the agenda states that October 1 is the date of release for the updated maps, we're still working through these changes and expect that they'll be completed sometime in October. I don't know if there's any questions about that. If not, I'll move on to a second announcement, which is that we received many requests from the council members here and also from members of the public that these meetings be held in a hybrid format with the ability to attend either in person or remotely. So that arrangement will be a complicated one, given the interpretation channels that are required and the need for an ample venue and enough room. So EEA has decided to hire a consultant to help us make these meetings hybrid in the near future. And we also aim to move these in-person portion of the hybrid meetings to various locations around the Commonwealth, including central and western portions of the state. So please stay tuned for that in the near future. Next slide, please.
Lydia has a question.
Oh, thank you. Yes, Lydia.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask for some clarification about the census data. Will we be able to incorporate I know that the mayor requested the city requested of Boston requested a what do you call it, a census of group quarters. And I don't know if there are other cities in the state that have also done that. Will we be able to incorporate that renewed data?
So Lydia, that's a great question. And that is exactly what we are working through right now in terms of the changes that's taking a little bit longer. So let me inquire about that, how we would be dealing with group quarters specifically around Boston and see how we would be addressing that with our GIS coordinator. Thank you for raising that. Any other questions about either of those two announcements? Okay, if not, I'll move on. Next slide, please, Val. So the next item on our agenda is a presentation by the Massachusetts Environmental Justice Roundtable, I should say the Environmental Justice Table. And I'll call on Maria Belen Power to start that off, please.
Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Maria Belen Power. I am the Associate Executive Director at Green Roots. And Green Roots is an environmental justice organization that for almost 30 years has been organizing and building power in our communities of Chelsea and East Boston for environmental justice. So we are I'm going to do a quick introduction to the Environmental Justice Table, and then a colleague will speak briefly about the history, and then another colleague will speak briefly about the role of the EJ Council and how we could support the EJ Council and how we can work together for environmental justice. So I am, let me start off by saying the Environmental Justice Table was convened in 2018, but it builds on the work of years and years, really decades of environmental justice across the Commonwealth. And we came together in particular for a very specific moment in time, which was a legislation, the legislative session. And we, again, building off of decades of work by allies and partners across the state, we realized in that session, in that legislative session, that environmental justice was mentioned in about 20 different bills. And we thought, well, let's come together and figure out how we collectively work on defining environmental justice and really achieving finally a big win for environmental justice communities across the Commonwealth. And so the table is really comprised of groups from all across the Commonwealth, both geographically as well as identity-wise, in terms of race, class, and language. So I'll go through just the members of the EJ table so you all know who is on the EJ table. And then I will pass it to my colleague, Sophia, to speak about the history of the environmental justice coalition and movement building. So a key part of the EJ table is that we are anchored and co-convened by environmental justice communities and environmental justice organizations. And so that is one particularity about our table, is that it is led by the folks that are most impacted by the issues, by environmental injustice. And those organizations right now, even though we're always expanding and reaching out to other communities across the Commonwealth who are not represented in the EJ table, but currently the co-conveners are 5 organizations and possibly one more. So Alternatives for Community and Environment, Green Roots, Neighbor to Neighbor, the Coalition for Social Justice, the North American Indian Center of Boston, and we are in conversations right now with Groundworks Lawrence to also be a co-convener. So the idea is that the conveners of the EJ table represent communities from all across the Commonwealth. Now, we also have allies and partners who are part of the EJ table who work together with us to move either policies or initiatives and projects that are led by environmental justice communities. And so the partners and the allies are sort of more traditional environmental organizations, as well as faith-based organizations. And like I said earlier with the conveners, we are always looking to expand the table and how we can build a big umbrella movement that supports environmental justice communities and environmental justice initiatives all across the Commonwealth. So the current members of the EJ table are, aside from the conveners, Green Energy Consumers, the Environmental League of Massachusetts, Clean Water Action, the Conservation Law Foundation, Lawyers for Civil Rights, the Union of Concerned Scientists, the Universal Unitarian UU Mass Action, and the Massachusetts Climate Action Network. So that is sort of the members of the environmental justice table. We meet sometimes once a week, sometimes every 2 weeks, sometimes once a month. It is, we work very, very hard to address the both harm that is being lived by environmental justice communities and also expand protections for the folks that are most impacted. And now I'll pass it to my colleague, Sophia Owen, from Alternatives for Community and Environment.
Thank you, Maria Belen. My name is Sophia. I am at Alternatives for Community and Environment, and I am our staff attorney and the director of our Environmental Justice Legal Services Program. So a little bit about ACE. ACE builds the power of communities of color and low-income communities in Massachusetts to eradicate environmental racism and classism, create healthy and sustainable communities, and to achieve environmental justice. Since our founding in 1994, our members and our staff have been at the forefront of the fight for environmental justice. In 2004, we transitioned to a member-led base building organization. We believe both community organizing and legal advocacy are necessary to remedy the impacts of systemic and environmental racism. As Maria Belen mentioned, there have been many iterations of people working together in Massachusetts to make progress on environmental justice. So I'm going to give a brief overview of those groups in which ACE has been a central leader. So starting in 1994, the Massachusetts Environmental Justice Assistance Network, which was anchored by ACE, brought together communities with attorneys, licensed site professionals, hydrologists, public health professionals, and others. The group was focused on campaign and specific work, not broader policy work, which led ACE to encourage the state to form the Massachusetts Environmental Justice Advisory Council to help develop the 2002 EJ policy. So in 2002, the EJ Council formed to help create the policy. In 2009, ACE created the Massachusetts EJ Alliance, which led to the creation of Massachusetts Executive Order 552, which I will get back to in a moment. So from 2009 to 2010, ACE convened the Massachusetts EJ Alliance, which was comprised of more than 20 grassroots organizations across the state. Our alliance engaged Governor Patrick, urging him to issue an environmental justice executive order, which I may refer to as the EJEO, and to fill the vacant state environmental justice director position. During this time, we also began drafting an EJ executive order to present to the Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. From 2011 to 2012, ACE assisted the Department of Environmental Protection in planning 5 EJ listening sessions across the state. And the EJ executive order was a priority demand at each session. In 2013, ACE submitted a revised environmental justice executive order draft to Energy and Environmental Affairs. Our EJ Alliance spoke to Governor Patrick, then EEA Secretary Rick Sullivan, and other officials on the need for an EJ executive order. At that point, the governor asked his staff to work with the EJ Alliance on the executive order. We then did have those discussions with EEA and began collecting postcards from residents to support the executive order. From winter to spring of 2014, the Massachusetts EJ Alliance met with EEA to continue discussions on the EJ executive order, and multiple drafts were exchanged between EEA and the EJ Alliance to go over the framework for the executive order. During that time, we also met with the Department of Environmental Protection to discuss increasing their attention to environmental justice populations. In the summer of 2014, the EJ Alliance met with EEA, MassDOT, and the Economic Development Department to continue discussions on the EJ executive order. Throughout that fall, we exchanged multiple drafts with EEA, HED, MassDOT, and finally reached agreement on language. On November 25th, 2014, Governor Patrick signed the executive order on environmental justice. On January 24th, 2015, EEA released a state EJ policy update. And in that policy update, the state reviewed and updated demographic data used to determine environmental justice neighborhoods. On May 24th, 2015, state agencies missed a deadline to implement EJ strategies. And at that time, the EJ director role was vacant and remained vacant for more than 3 years. We continued to work to address these issues. And in 2019, as Maria Belen mentioned, we formed the Environmental Justice Table to move forward. I'm going to hand it now to my colleague, Stacy Rubin from Conservation Law Foundation to talk about the role of the EJ Council.
Thank you, Sophia. And we are also really grateful to be here today to communicate with the EJ Council. It's been our position that this group should have formed back in 2015. So we are thrilled that in 2022, it is now happening, and that those of us who have been in this fight for a long time can communicate with all of you. So when we were working on the environmental justice population definition during the early part of the last legislative session, we were looking at whether to define environmental justice populations based on demographic criteria or demographic criteria in addition to exposures to brownfields or hazardous facilities or otherwise. As Sophia mentioned, historically in Massachusetts, there has been a long history dating back to 2002 of defining environmental justice populations based on demographic criteria: race, income, limited English proficiency, and in an earlier phase, nationality. There were numerous definitions that we considered. The Environmental Justice Table worked with our legislative sponsors, Representatives Miranda, Representative Dubois, Representative Modero, Senator DiDomenico, and Senator Eldridge. We also worked with data and mapping experts, such as Dr. Marcos Luna, who will say more later in this meeting. We had consensus about the criteria that we wanted to use: race alone, income alone, race plus income, and limited English proficiency. One concern that we discussed for many, many months was balancing the desire to assure that the environmental justice designation for communities of color was protected and broadly applicable, as well as the concern about not having an over-inclusion of wealthier communities. We looked at numerous studies and even more experiences of people knowing that race is the primary predictor of living near a hazardous, polluting, or dangerous facility. It was important to us to retain the 4 criteria, and the race plus income category was meant to try and ensure that communities of color were protected, but only up to a certain income level. We then wanted to consider whether to look at exposures in addition to demographics. For example, overlaying communities of color with exposure to Superfund sites and brownfields. We found it difficult to determine whether a neighborhood was enough polluted in order to qualify for that designation. Therefore, we went through numerous exercises to determine the thresholds or percentages to tie to the 4 demographic criteria. We believe that the statute that we now have, which the Environmental Justice Table was the lead advocate in making sure we were successful in bringing it into the statutes, could protect those 4 demographic criteria. We recommend that this EJ Council has the ability to influence the percent thresholds of what numbers of people of color or limited English proficient residents can qualify as an environmental justice population. We were also thrilled that the EJ law now includes a requirement for a community to petition to opt in. A smaller subset of a geography that meets one of the 4 demographic criteria can petition. And we think this council can help determine what that opt-in process looks like. One question for you all to consider is who is missing from the EJ population designation. For example, we have wonderful friends and colleagues in East Freetown, Massachusetts, a Cape Verdean community that for years wanted to receive the EJ population designation, about a 1-mile stretch of land with a lot of environmental hazards and a community of color. So we were unable to figure out the data and thresholds to get East Freetown in, but are hoping that they will be able to petition to opt in. This council has the responsibility and opportunity to really help define the opt-in process, the percent thresholds that meet the criteria. Our hope also is for you to help think about how we might ensure broad protection on the basis of demographics for EJ population designation, and think through maybe a narrower set of locations that meet multiple criteria that would be eligible for targeted funding and investments. We also hope that this council will influence the cumulative impact assessment process that is also going on with agencies. And now I will turn it over to Andrea Nemicha to talk about why this law matters.
Thank you, Stacy, and hello, everyone. The EJ statute will impact real people and make differences between poorly sited energy infrastructure and equitable distribution of green space and renewables. For many years, it did not matter if a population was designated as EJ, because being an EJ population under the EJ policy didn't get you anywhere. Now that we have an EJ law, it requires procedural substantive justice. It requires language access with translation and multilingual simultaneous interpretation, like what we are doing today. And it also requires substantive justice, like acknowledging disproportionate burdens and redressing those burdens in EJ populations. I personally have been involved in preventing a polluting biomass facility out in Springfield and insufficient commuter rail options to the South Shore and Central Mass. Prior to the EJ law, agencies were not required to consider the distribution of benefits and burdens when addressing permits for energy facilities or consider EJ populations when assessing transit service. We hope the EJ Council will work with EJ advocates to ensure both procedural and substantive justice provisions get implemented. And I see in the chat, where do I work? I'm actually a lone supporter of the EJ Council. I was formerly at Neighbor to Neighbor, but here to support the EJ table and the long history of work that people have put into making this EJ statute possible. And I will pass it over to Maria Belen.
And Andrea is being too humble. She was instrumental in the EJ table for many, many years. So my role is to close out our presentation and to really reinforce our desire to work with the EJ Council, our desire to really advance environmental justice across the Commonwealth. You have already, all of you hopefully, have already received an email from me for us to meet. We are cautious about open meeting law, and so I have only reached out to you in groups of 3 or 4, and we want to make sure that we abide by that, which is why we're doing it in small chunks. And so we have some dates that we threw out to each of you, and so I will be looking at all of those dates and respond in terms of which dates work for each of the different groups that we would like to meet with you. I believe it's 2 groups of 3 and 1 group of 4, but I may be forgetting the exact members per group. So really appreciative of all of your work. I know how much work it is to be on a council that is sort of outside of your paid 9 to 5 job, and it is deeply appreciated the work and your commitment and time into making this historic Environmental Justice Council be extremely successful and protect environmental justice communities across the Commonwealth. So I will close there. I guess two very quick comments before I close. Just really congratulations to Rishi Reddy and her team for the work to make this happen. And the language piece is extremely important. And I'm very, just want to congratulate you, Rishi, and your team for, it is the first time, I have to say, ever that I register for a Zoom where you get to pick which language you choose. And so that is, that's huge. That is like historic for the Commonwealth, and that is a big step towards language justice. And I look forward to meeting you all individually or in small groups. So thank you.
Thanks so much to the EJ table, and thank you for recognizing the effort for pulling the language pieces together. It is hard, and it is something that the state is striving to do properly and more and more. The team that has helped pull this together is, of course, vast. It's Valerie Cardozo, who's the deputy director, and all of the interpreters here, and the vendors, and the minute takers and the recorders, many of whom are on the Environmental Justice Task Force at EEA, who have helped to make this happen. So there is a group of 20 to 25 of us, some of whom you will the council members will meet at our next meeting, I hope, to give a presentation about what the EJ Task Force has been doing internally at the agencies. But for now, I want to thank the EJ table for this presentation, and also for sharing with us your level of expertise and the depth of expertise, and how many years this coalition of environmental justice advocates have been working towards EJ in the Commonwealth. I want to open up the floor for just a few minutes, being conscious of time. If any of the council members had questions for the EJ table at this point, I want to allow that to go forward if there are any.
I look forward to further discussions with the EJ table. Got the invitation, so hopefully next week.
And I'd like to acknowledge all of the work that they've done. I mean, this work has been going on for decades. And I am sure, particularly in the beginning, it was beyond an uphill battle with nobody listening. You know, that's my assumption, with absolutely nobody listening. So just kudos to all of you. And I do absolutely look forward to working with you as well. Your work is vital and really important to everything that we're doing, but you already know that.
Yeah, I don't have any questions right now, but just thank you for that background and looking forward to working together.
I also appreciate how conscious everyone is about our restrictions under the open meeting law, that folks cannot meet, a quorum of the EJ Council cannot meet and discuss EJ related issues outside of these meetings. So I appreciate the EJ table's recognition of the inability to meet with the larger group and to parcel out the groups into smaller folks, and that we always comply with the spirit of the open meeting law, which requires that no substantive type of discussions go forward outside of this open and transparent process. So thank you for all that. If there's no more comments, I would like to move on to the next agenda topic. The next item on our agenda pertains to what this EJ Council is required to accomplish under the terms of the Climate Roadmap Statute passed in March 2021. So next slide, please, Val. Thank you. Under the Climate Act, the EJ Council must advise and provide recommendations to the Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs on relevant policies and standards to achieve the EJ principles. That is the general portion of its duty, and a specific portion of its duty is what we will start on in our next agenda item, which is to conduct a comprehensive analysis every 5 years to ensure the definition of EJ population achieves the objectives of the environmental justice principles. So next slide, please, Val. As a reminder to the council members, this slide includes the definition of EJ population under the Act currently. It includes 3 criteria: low-income populations, households with limited English proficiency, and neighborhoods of color. Next slide, please, Val. For the next topic, Council Member Dr. Marcos Luna will provide us with a brief history of environmental justice policy in Massachusetts and how it pertained to the development of this definition.
Thank you, Rishi. Good morning again, everyone. So I'm going to give you a brief history that will overlap a lot with what you heard from the EJ legislative table, which is intentional. So any story about environmental justice policy begins with a common origin story that most people will tell, and that's a protest that erupted in 1982 in North Carolina over the disposal of hazardous waste in a landfill in a Black community. And the protesters were arguing that this dumping of the waste in that particular community was very deliberate, that it was a form of racism, and that it was part of a larger pattern. And that argument resonated with people across the country. Hundreds of people were arrested in the process. And follow-up studies by the federal government, as well as independent researchers and organizations, found that those claims were in fact true. Well, insofar as the pattern was very real. All across the country, we find that hazardous waste is disproportionately located in communities of color and low-income communities. And very importantly, race was often the leading factor, the leading predictor of where we would find these things. Next slide, please. The environmental justice movement that emerges from this consciousness, from this language, does 2 very important things. it opens up our understanding of what the word environment means. Environment does not just mean nature or the protection of nature. It includes the human environment, the built environment, the systems that create and maintain that environment. This is the environment in environmental justice. The second thing that it does is it asserts, it demonstrates that environmental inequality is inseparable from social inequality. We cannot address one without the other. That, in fact, when we talk about environmental inequality or inequity, we're really talking about a civil rights issue. Next slide, please. At the federal level, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency is the first to really pick this up. And over the course of the 1990s, various iterations of different policy responses occur. This culminates in 1994 with an executive order issued by then President Clinton, which directs that all federal agencies make environmental justice part of their missions. That policy sets some important precedents when we think about environmental justice policy. One, it asserts that environmental justice is not just the responsibility of the environmental agency, but rather all agencies of government, which all have a role in creating the human environment. Second, it establishes two important pillars of environmental justice policy: a focus on the distribution of burdens, who is bearing more or less of these burdens, what we call distributional equity. But it also focuses on the process by which this happens, what we call procedural equity, essentially drawing attention to whether or not communities that are affected are involved or have a voice in the process. And these are two very important pillars of environmental justice policy that we'll see echoed both nationally, but also locally. That's the federal level. And just to bring us up to date, the Biden-Harris administration has, while this executive order has never gone away, but the current administration has reinforced this with new executive orders that have broadened the reach, the scope, and the specificity of how environmental justice should be implemented across the country. But a lot of decisions are made at the state and local level, and that's what our story brings us back to Massachusetts. Next slide, please. There's a parallel effort happening in Massachusetts, and it starts at the grassroots level in community-based organizations that are responding to this new language, to this understanding of this problem that they've already actually been working on. Alternatives for Community and Environment, or ACE, we've heard from earlier, is one of the earliest to be involved in this. And they're at the hub of this new network that's created, this Environmental Justice Assistance Network, that brings together a variety of different organizations, not just environmental organizations, but organizations working to make the human environment safer, better, and more uplifting for its residents, particularly those who've been marginalized. This attention to environmental justice in Massachusetts expresses itself at the official level by the early 2000s, when then the Executive Office of Environmental Affairs convenes an Environmental Justice Advisory Committee that brings together stakeholders and organizes meetings across the state to talk to communities to find out what it is that they're not getting, what's going on in their communities, what might the state do to begin to address this issue. And that work is following alongside of new research showing that, yes, indeed, just like across the nation, Massachusetts has a problem in terms of the inequitable distribution of environmental burdens, as well as the lack of participation of the communities that are most affected. This results in a new policy being issued by the Office of Environmental Affairs in 2002 that establishes the first environmental justice policy in the state, and will be foundational and I think familiar to this advisory committee at this point. Next slide, please. That first policy that emerges does a lot of important things that are very similar to what the federal executive order did. One, it makes clear who the policy is aimed at. It's specifically at the communities, minority and low-income communities that have been historically marginalized and overburdened. It establishes the two pillars of what that policy should look like and how it should work. There should be a focus on distributional equity, where the burdens are, where they are concentrated, and also on how the process plays out, on encouraging, creating opportunities for participation by the communities that are most affected. And what is most familiar, I think, it lays out the definitions that we have mostly today too. At that time, there were 4 criteria that were laid out: income, minority status, limited English speaking, and a foreign-born population, which I'll tell you about later what happens to that one. Next slide, please. The policy that originated in 2002 was important, but it was limited because it only came from one state agency. There was an appetite by advocates of environmental justice to increase the scope of the policy so they could reach statewide and have a larger impact, not just in one agency, but across the government. And that effort to create a statewide policy, as you heard earlier, was led by this Massachusetts Environmental Justice Alliance. That was an alliance of a variety of organizations and stakeholders from across the state who work over a number of years with the Office of Environmental Affairs to draft an executive order. As you heard Sophia Owen speak earlier, describing the multiple milestones in that process, it was fairly drawn out, but it also involved statewide meetings to bring together different stakeholders to give input in what this process should look like and what the output should look like. And it results, of course, in that 2014 executive order that, just like its federal counterpart, makes environmental justice the mission of all state agencies in Massachusetts. So in many ways, it very much does enlarge the scope and the reach and the meaning of environmental justice. That policy, though, was somewhat precarious because it was an executive order. It didn't have the permanent say of legislation. And in fact, that executive order was issued at the tail end of the Patrick administration, right before Governor Baker came in. And because it's an executive order, it's at the discretion of the sitting executive. So there's always a possibility that it could be rescinded. As it turns out, the Baker administration would adopt the policy, and a revised policy would come out again in 2017. Next slide, please. So that 2017 revision keeps most of the policy that we've seen previously in terms of defining who it's aimed at, which communities we're talking about, in terms of a focus on both distributional equity, procedural equity, but it revises the definition a bit. It keeps the minority community threshold, it keeps the limited English proficient household threshold, and it keeps the income threshold, but it takes out the foreign-born population threshold. My understanding is that it was primarily because of a change in the way the census reported its data, which made it difficult to actually identify those particular communities. So this policy is what we've been most familiar with for some time. But again, it has the same limitation in the sense that now we have a statewide reach and we have a clear definition, but it's still an executive order. Next slide, please. So by 2018 or 19, my dates might be a little off here, a new coalition emerges, convened by the legislative table, the EJ legislative table that you heard about, finding a window of opportunity to bring forward a legislative solution to environmental justice in the state. And that will eventually result in an amendment that goes into the climate roadmap bill that gets signed into law by Governor Baker last March in 2021. And that bill does, for the first time, put a definition of environmental justice into law, into statute, and also clearly defines who those communities are. That bill then will end up in a revision of the policy that came out in June of 2021. And this is the policy that we have in front of us right now that we'll be reviewing. Next slide, please. So that environmental policy has kept, I think, most of the elements of the policies that went before it in terms of the target populations of concern or the priority populations, in terms of identifying focus on both the distribution of those burdens on different communities and benefits, And it also focuses on the processes by which this happens, in particular emphasizing methods of encouraging more participation by the affected communities, particularly those vulnerable communities that have historically not been able to participate. It does make a revision to the definition, to the criteria again, of those populations. So income and limited English proficiency, those remain unchanged. What changes is the minority threshold. So now it has been raised to 40% from 25%. And then there's a fourth criterion, if you will, that combines income with minority. And that one is essentially to capture those minority communities that are in not wealthy communities, also trying to keep the scope and the reach of the communities that are included more restricted. And in fact, as a participant in the process of analyzing and looking through various options, this is one of the things that was important to us, is that we're trying to keep the criteria tight so that it identifies just those communities and doesn't pull in too many communities that we don't associate with environmental justice. But of course, this is the heart of the discussion, how to do that. We did look also, as Stacy Rubin said earlier, at other ways of measuring environmental justice. But when we look at it, and we're not alone, this is a very popular topic amongst EJ researchers, we find that these criteria, race, income, and the limited English proficiency, are very powerful predictors of not just the typical problems that we see in front of us to do with pollution and other conventional environmental problems, but even the emerging ones. We think about like the climate change and exposure to heat and other risks. We find that a lot of these are also captured by these same indicators. So we found that these were particularly powerful. And so the question is, how can we improve them? How can we improve these criteria? How can we improve the definition of what an environmental justice community is? So I'm sure I left out important milestones and important contributors. This has been a multi-decade process involving a lot of people, and I apologize if I left out something important, but I want to thank you for the opportunity to present a short history of this policy and how it came about.
Thank you so much, Marcos. I'm wondering if there's any questions from the council members as to some of the things you've outlined here.
I have one question, which we can take offline if it's too involved. I'm just wondering, back to, I think it was like in 99, 2000, there was an effort around creating an areas of critical environmental justice concern process when new sightings of things, like basically when anything that was going through the MEPA process had to also keep in mind areas of environmental concern. And then there was this effort to create a definition around areas of environmental justice concern. And I'm just wondering if there was sort of any insight from that process. And I was surprised that it wasn't mentioned in any of the history that had been reviewed. And was that just like a total failure as a process, or I guess what is the question, but it might be a long answer. So fine if you want to defer it.
I can provide a short answer to that. The specifics of the proposal for the area of environmental justice concern, I'm not as familiar with. The documents that I've reviewed and the conversations I've had with folks who were involved at the time, there was already an initiative in 2000 to have it so it was internal conversation about environmental justice, but I didn't see any output from that I could identify. So I don't know beyond that what happened to that initiative.
I actually don't either, Namrata. I was sort of on the sidelines at that time. I know that the discussion was going forward. I don't recall what happened at the end. Are there any other questions regarding the presentation, which I'm hoping will inform our discussion? I think we can take down the maps unless folks wanted to keep it up for any reason. Do people need some more time with the next? So one thing that I would like for us to keep in mind as we move forward is this history that we've just heard. And also, one of the questions I want us to address today is what form the work product of this council might take. So for instance, should what we present at the end of our comprehensive analysis be a written report? Should it be an oral report that we provide directly to the Secretary of EEA? Should it be something in between? That's sort of the first issue I'd like to address. A little bit later today, I'd like to address how we get to that work product, whether we need to divide up into work groups, whether we need to do a little more research and how we might conduct that research. But for right now, I'd love some feedback on what folks on the council think the work product should be. And this doesn't have to be our last time that we are deliberating on this. I'd like to gather your feedback. And if you have any individual thoughts, to send them directly to Val. If you have any thoughts after this meeting, that you could send those thoughts just in single emails, not to the group of us, because we're not going to be deliberating outside of this formal meeting. But if you had individual emails sent to Val with some thoughts and input, we can gather these together and present to the council the next time we meet a choice of 2 or 3 options for the work product, and then we would be able to vote and decide on it at that time. So this is more of a brainstorming session of what we think this work product might be.
I do have a comment. This is Pat Spence. Should I proceed with my comment?
Please go ahead, Pat. Thank you.
So clearly written documentation of what we come up with is of critical importance. But at any given time, when we can actually bring someone in to hear what we have to say verbally, so that, if it's appropriate, speaking from our communities or speaking from where we sit, that always adds the personal touch, in my opinion, to any recommendations one can make. I mean, over the course of the years in urban agriculture, when there has been time to present to committee or different members of Congress, etc., it always made an impact for them also to hear from people on the ground and not just read the report. So I don't know if that's inviting someone into our space or us going someplace else, but I think seeing and hearing people and what they have to say is important.
Thank you for that, Pat. The primary role of this council is to be advising the secretary. So if I interpret your comment in that context, I think what you're saying is that a written report has great value, but you would like to have an opportunity perhaps to speak with the secretary or other senior staff at EEA who advise the secretary on what we've learned.
Yes.
That approach makes sense to me as well.
Is that Kalila?
Yes.
Please, please go ahead, Kalila. We'd love your thoughts on that if you had additional.
Just that I agree that a written report and some kind of virtual or in-person conversation, depending on where we're at.
And a written report of the type, Namratha, are you about?
Yeah,
to-
I just wanted
Please
to
go
comment.
ahead.
I kind of feel like a lot of it depends, since the audience is the secretary, finding out what the secretary's preferences and like what would be most productive for the secretary. Feels like that would be the guidance in terms of what type of product would be most helpful.
Okay. Thank you for that. Were there other thoughts?
This is Kalila again, just a question about, in addition to the secretary, also just if there's a process for getting whatever conclusions, what our work products out to the public, what would that look like?
So I think for both Namratha's comment and Kalila's, one thing to keep in mind is that the context of this is that any report that advises the secretary would also be a public record. It would be a public document, so that anything that would go to her in that context would be available to the public as well. We would be informing not only her, but others in the Commonwealth who are able to read that report. Anybody else that we could, and again, this is a brainstorming questioning session so that we can consolidate some of these thoughts and put them in for more formal decision-making next time we meet. So if folks have other thoughts, please do send an email directly to Valerie without CCing everyone else, just directly to her with something that you would like to add to this discussion, and we will consolidate those for next time. The second part of this discussion is what, in what ways, given what you've heard, would we need to do additional work or separate out into work groups or some other form of additional research to get the information that we would need to make decisions around the percentage of populations that are in EJ groups.
This is Cheryl Holly. I have a question on the slide. The last slide we looked at, it said something about opt-in EJ communities.
Cher, could you speak up a little bit more? I can't hear you. I don't know if others have that problem.
Can you hear me now? I have my hearing aids in. I talk louder without them. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I was wondering about the last slide that we looked at. It said something, the second point said opt-in EJ communities. I'm just wondering what that means, because I guess what bothers me most is that the neighborhoods and the grids, and sometimes people of color can have low income and still be living in nice neighborhoods and still struggling with environmental injustice. So not everybody lives, especially in central and western Mass, lives in a neighborhood with everyone else. So I just wondered what that second point meant exactly. The EJ communities.
So the opt-in provision, you feel, doesn't quite spell out the reality on the ground for non-Eastern parts of the state. Am I stating that correctly?
I just wanted to know what that second point meant exactly. When Dr. Luna was explaining, I didn't quite pick that up.
I can explain it briefly. So this is Marcos. The policy has language that says that a community that is not, I'm paraphrasing here, I'm just looking up the document, that doesn't get captured as an environmental justice community by the normal process, which is a census-based process, can opt in by petitioning the secretary to be included. And that is not entirely clear how the geography of that is defined or exactly what would be the base criteria, but it seems to sound like if you have a smaller community that doesn't fit into the way the census defines communities or neighborhoods, like census block groups, that a community could petition to be recognized as a community or a neighborhood that met the criteria and might otherwise be considered an environmental justice community and fall under those provisions of the policy.
This is Cheryl again, like a tribe.
Yeah, I guess so. I think that's the open question about what that would look like. I think right now, my impression is that, not my impression, I know that communities that are identified as environmental justice are geographically defined. So the census collects data and they break up the state into these little, we call them neighborhoods, but they can vary in size, and these little block groups. And they look at who lives in there, and they look at the proportion of people who are people of color or limiting proficiency or their income levels. And that's how they decide it. And so the opt-in sort of sounds like it follows this geographic definition, but I don't know what that would mean in another context. But certainly if it was a community that defined itself geographically, that would be kind of easy in a way, because you can put the boundaries around it. But Melissa has her hand up. I'll let her respond to that too.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I think it just kind of goes back to way back when in the beginning that we had discussed this, and that, you know, for instance, Herring Pond, we're in Plymouth, and I couldn't see the maps, you know, totally on my screen, but there are a lot of areas, as Chief Hawley had mentioned, that for tribal indigenous people may not be anywhere on that map. A lot of us and many of us live in these resort communities, especially on Cape Cod. And I know that we did talk about possibly creating some sort of a layer or map that sort of overlays the current EJ map to define the, you know, the reservation lands or traditional homelands of the indigenous people. Because as Chief Hawley also, you know, mentioned, there are many people in our tribal communities who are, you know, qualify under that and are low income and should be identified. So I don't know how that looks. This is really our second meeting and there's a lot of work to do. But yeah, thank you, Chief Hawley, for mentioning that with that, you know, what does that mean? And for, you know, my question, I guess it is, how do we identify those communities? I know this isn't just about, obviously, indigenous communities and tribal communities, but there certainly, you know, needs to be a way to do that.
Melissa, for clarifying that. Yeah, that's what I mean. Is not all communities can be defined by geography.
So Chief Hawley, I think that what you've identified and what others have followed up with is an issue that is going to be one of the main issues that we're dealing with in the substance of our work, that geographically based definition and the ways in which right now the EJ policy does refer to indigenous communities, but you know, to understand that definition through a map, so much is lost. Like, we cannot do that for the indigenous community. We're not able to translate what we know onto the map. So this is a issue, I think, that's core. So let me just turn that a little bit to the agenda item. In order to be able to address an issue like that, what would you propose in terms of what is the type of work process that we would need to be able to address that issue? You know, what is the additional information that's needed and how would we gain it?
That's a very complex question, you know, because I always say I can only speak for the lands for Herring Pond because I know where my territory is. but I could never, step out of line and speak for another community. So I think that's a specific, for the tribal communities, that's a specific question for each community, and sort of trying to figure out where these, because some boundaries overlap as well, so it can be very tricky. That's a good question. How does that look? So.
So again, we are undertaking that very conversation, the tribes themselves, hopefully very, very soon. So it might be sort of a concurrent discussion.
Okay. Are there other thoughts on these two items of what the work product should be and how we might go about completing the work product?
This is Lydia Lowe. I agree with what other people had said about a combination of written and conversation in terms of work product. And I guess in terms of the, some of the work that needs to happen, I'm just really appreciating how complex this is, listening to all the presentations and the conversation. And I feel a need to learn more myself because I only know my local community and the EJ issues there. I'd like to, be able to understand more about, are there maps of the different kinds of, pollutants across the state, understanding the numbers in terms of population, POC, and limited English, and especially understanding much more the both the history and current status of different tribal communities. I think all of those, those are all really important, and there's a lot to learn. So I'm wondering if there's already a certain body of work that, has been done, to get us to this point, if you can point us to things to look at, to start that process.
So thank you for that comment. And I see Caroline's hand up, and I'll just let her speak in a moment. But just to address your point, Lydia, I am putting together a collection of resources and research that's been done on these topics, and hope to have those up on the EJ Council webpage soon. I've received more than one request for this, for folks to be, every one of us here has a different area of expertise. And what they bring to this conversation on the council is unique and in-depth for the areas that they know well. So how we make these decisions to consolidate them into one policy and one report is part of the trick of this group, I think. And so these resource materials, whether it's going to be some reading materials that I'll put together, maybe it will be some video resources as well, I hope will bring us all to the same page. So we have a little bit of knowledge about the context in which each of us is working in. So thank you for that request. And we will be working to fulfill that, I hope, very soon. Caroline, I just want to recognize you have your hand up.
Great, thank you. This is Caroline Hahn. I did actually, I think along the lines of what Lydia was asking for around resources, I was actually wondering whether or not we've done any comparisons with other states and their thresholds, for example, or different policies, not necessarily to model after, but just to understand what those implications might be as we look at it. And if we have historically done that benchmarking, if we could have that information available. So just so we can have a frame of reference as well.
Thank you. We are constantly in touch with other states, and recognize that it is helpful to do that in many ways, but that also each state's population is so different and our histories are so different. But I think when we're talking about this in the context of a report, it may well be that we can look to some of what they've done. Certainly, New Jersey has been an example in this field, and California as well. I see Pat Spence's hand up. Is that from now, Pat, or from before? Okay.
Now, again, this is Pat Spence, and Lydia, I'm not sure. I think you are also alluding to, and forgive me if I'm wrong, that I'm not sure if I want to go into a breakout group right now to work on a specific. There's so much, and everybody on the council, I'm still trying to get to know through this device called Zoom, and I would never have wanted to miss Chief Hawley's comments, and so I'm not ready to go into a great breakout group. I'm still learning it all right now. Certainly they would be more efficient, but not when you're just coming into this subject matter, at least for me.
Okay. So you're not, I think what you're saying, Pat, is you wouldn't be ready to do anything with a more specific view with like a separate work?
Not yet.
Until you know more. Okay.
Yeah,
thank you.
not yet.
All right. Any others? I'm wondering if there's any other thoughts? Right now, I don't see any other hands up. Perhaps
Peter's hand is up.
Peter Mothy, please go ahead. Yes.
Thank you, Peter Mate here. So along the lines of what's also been mentioned, but just to add on to it as well, as I'm thinking through this, discovery and research to understanding what exists. So are there any recommendations? Have there been any proposals? Data that we can look at to actually reflect on, because the way I envision this is the step thereafter is sort of the analysis and development of solutions, right? So what are the considerations, like have been mentioned that we need to take into account? How are we making those decisions? How do we know when we've arrived at a decision? The debate component of it before we finally have something to propose. I would love to see that sort of laid out in a process, but more importantly, it's that repository of research and or proposals, concepts put together in one place so we can systematically go through, because myself, I'm getting up to speed in different places. I'm assuming people are doing the same thing, but how do we all get to the same point of understanding and focus on the exact same problem?
Thank you, Peter. Okay.
Sorry, this is Kalila. Can I just ask an additional question about the work groups? If we do get to that point of making those decisions, just curious about what support is available for those working groups. Like, are we scheduling them on our own? Like how, I don't know enough about how that process is being managed. And then also if there's an expert in a particular area that we would want to consult with, can we do that? What would be the process to do that?
Thank you for those thoughts. So I just ask that if anybody has any further thoughts on either of these two topics, that they submit those ideas to Valerie by September 21st. And we will be able to consolidate those and have them appear on our agenda and presentation slides in time for the next meeting. So we could have a bit more of a directed conversation about them. So please just keep that in mind, September 21st, to get those comments in. So I would like to move on to the next agenda item, which is about one of EEA's major Commonwealth-wide initiatives in this moment. It's the Clean Energy and Environment Plan. This plan is seeking to incorporate environmental justice, energy justice, and climate justice in all facets of its implementation. So this briefing that we're about to hear will help inform this council's future perspectives on the implementation of the plan. So I will hand it over to Han Chu. Han, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Rishi. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. I'm just, if you can move to the next slide, Val. Spend some time, few minutes, 15 minutes speaking with you all about our Commonwealth-wide planning efforts for a clean.
Han, could I just interrupt for just a moment? I want to make sure that everyone can hear you clearly. You're a little bit soft for me, but it may be that everyone else can hear you.
Can everyone hear me all right?
Can we just get a thumbs up from folks if they can hear Han? Okay.
Okay, I'll try to speak louder.
Okay, okay, thank you.
So yeah, wanted to speak with you all about the Commonwealth-wide planning efforts for a clean energy and climate future and get your thoughts. This planning effort was formalized by passage of the Global Warming Solutions Act in 2008 and subsequently strengthened by the climate law last year. Val, if you can move to the next slide. The GWSA, the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2008, first required legally binding limits on greenhouse gas emissions in the Commonwealth for 2020, 2030, and 2050, and directed our executive office to develop plans to achieve those limits. The climate law from last year, the act creating a next generation roadmap for Massachusetts climate policy, required that the 2030 emissions limit be at least 50% below the 1990 baseline, and the 2050 emissions limit be at least 85% below the 1990 baseline, and achieve net zero emissions. Additionally, this new law requires that the emissions limit be placed on specific sectors, what we call sublimits. And those specific sectors are listed on the slide here. And additionally, I hear a lot of folks in the commission are interested in land. I hope you are happy to hear that this law for the first time codified the definition of natural and working lands, and it requires the tracking of greenhouse gas emissions and carbon sequestration on natural and working lands, which we just put it's referred to as NWL for short. And then we also have to set goals and develop plan as part of the clean energy and climate plan to reduce these emissions and enhance carbon sequestration on natural and working lands. And lastly, on this slide, just wanted to also note that the new climate law from last year requires that we track the implementation of our clean energy and climate plans through the progress tracking of numeric benchmarks of different products that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, as well as other solutions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so next slide, please. Thus far, we have had 2 clean energy and climate plans released for the Commonwealth. The first one was originally released the first one was for 2020, and it was originally released in 2010, and then subsequently updated in 2015. And the second one, the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2030, was released at the end of December 2020. First as an interim plan to receive public comments, but then it was updated and released as an updated plan in June, this past June, to incorporate statutory requirements of last year's climate plan and to become a combined clean energy and climate plan for 25 and 2030. This slide here, I included hyperlinks to the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2020 and the one for 2025 and 2030. And I can put that in the chat as well. I can do that quickly. So you all have a record of it. And let's see, we are right now, our office right now is ferociously working to develop the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2050, which is required by last year's climate law to be released no later than January 1 of 2023. So we only have a few more months left to do this plan. And so next slide, please. This slide here is our rough timeline to develop and complete this 2050 CECP. We already started outlining the scope of this plan last month and are about to start the initial drafting. We plan to have a draft for internal agency reviews next month and for the Gov's office review in November. Analysis for our 2050 plan has already been completed because it's based on the analysis for the 2050 decarbonization roadmap study, which was conducted in 2019 and 2020. It was a 2-year wide effort, and the reports for that effort are located on our website, and I'll put that in the chat right now so you have it for your record. And so this analysis was completed and it was slightly updated for our 2030 CECP. And so we are continuing to use that analysis for our 2050 plan. Starting early next month, we will have a series of public hearings on the proposed sector-specific emissions sublimits for 2050, proposed goals for natural working lands, and proposed strategies and commitments to achieve these limits, goals, and net zero greenhouse gas emissions. By the end of December of this year, our secretary will formally adopt the emissions limits and sublimits for 2050, as well as release the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2050 in English and the top 5 non-English speaking languages in Massachusetts. So that's Spanish, Portuguese, Haitian Creole, Chinese, and Vietnamese. We are in the process of developing a website to provide more information about this public process, as well as to be the home of the 2050 CECP once it is completed. And the next slide is a rough preliminary outline of what the 2050 CECP will cover. And I'm happy to spend a couple of minutes to talk through this right now with you all to give you a sense of what our plan scope for this plan is. And then I would love to get your thoughts on additional topics that we should include or additional policy priorities that we should be including. Just know that we have tried to incorporate a lot of the feedback that we have received from prior clean energy and climate plans, especially those feedback that touch upon environmental justice considerations. And so at the top here, at the start of this 2050 CECP, we want to communicate what is this net zero 2050 vision for the Commonwealth and what does that entail? That entails transitioning a lot of our vehicles and buildings to be non-emitting or very low emitting, burning instead of fossil fuel, but using electricity and other low carbon fuels or carbon neutral fuels. And then we want to really communicate the importance of making sure that this transition to a new clean and green economy and society is equitable and just, making sure that we don't leave anyone behind in this transition and allowing that the transition doesn't further exacerbate the environmental disparities in EJ communities and bring benefits to everyone, including EJ communities. And then we will discuss what are our specific limits for the entire state, for the entire greenhouse gas, for the statewide greenhouse gas level, as well as specific sector emissions level for 2050. And we will talk about what this future of fuels will look like. Right now, there's use of fossil fuel, but then as well as renewable fuel. And we want to make sure that in the future, the transition away from fossil fuel is a way that is both honest to what the atmosphere sees in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and sequestration. So that's the next topic that we'll address in the plan, is like, what is the carbon sequestration potential in our natural working lands, and what is the role of additional sequestration beyond the scope of our natural working lands. And then we'll go into specific strategies and commitments that we will pursue in the next 3 decades for transportation, buildings, power, non-energy industrial processes, as well as natural working lands, to make sure that we can achieve an 85% emissions reduction statewide and net zero emissions by 2050. And we want to make sure that we talk about cross-cutting strategies, strategies that go beyond just one sector, for example, workforce development needs, as well as further community engagement and education, and then other priorities that require cross-sectoral collaboration and coordination. And and then we'll communicate again our analysis of economic and employment benefits for this transition to a cleaner and greener economy. And so that's what we're thinking thus far for the scope of this clean energy and climate plan. And we'd love to get your thoughts on additional topics and priorities that we should include in this plan. The next slide here is just giving you all an email, our email. So any feedback that you provide here, I'll bring it back to the team. But if you have additional feedback that you'd like to provide, you can certainly email me, but you can also email our team's email account, gwsa@mass.gov, and we'll note that and provide your comments to the appropriate people as needed. And I'll end here.
Thank you, Han. Do you have a couple of minutes to just entertain some questions from the council if they have some?
Yes, happy to.
Okay, so just want to open up the floor if any of the council members have a question for Han.
This is Marcos. I have a question. Thank you for that presentation. I'm curious to what extent the decarbonization plan has metrics around equity in terms of how it's implemented, because I know with the energy efficiency programs that have been in the state for some time, there's always been questions about how it's been rolled out equitably, and I know that's a hard thing to do, but is there a plan for measuring the implementation that way?
Yeah, something I didn't bring up because I was very focused on the documents, the plans itself, but yeah, I wanted to also let everyone know that we are working on a dashboard, an online dashboard, where we will be tracking our progress towards the goals and commitments that we put in the 2030 CCP. And so it will communicate how we're doing in terms of greenhouse gas reductions, in terms of like number of heat pumps installed, electric vehicles purchased and driven. And I admit that the current version that we are working on, this alpha version of this dashboard, won't be able to have equity metrics, but that's something that we really want to pursue for the beta version to be released sometime next year. And we engaged with the Global Warming Solutions Act Implementation Advisory Committee in August about some of the metrics that they would like to see. And they also brought up the importance of measuring implementation from an equity perspective. So they have some suggestions of equity metrics. In the Climate Justice Working Group of the IEC also in 2020, I think, also provided suggested metrics. And so that's something that we're gonna be reviewing in the next year to see, like, of those metrics, which ones can we find data for, reliable data for, and track on an annual or regular basis.
If just a quick follow-up, I would just suggest that if it's possible to ask that any data collected at all always be tied to geography somewhere that can be reported. And also, if it's at a household level, some basic anonymized information about who's being served by those things.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll definitely put all that into consideration.
Were there any other questions from the council members? If not, then I'll say thank you, Han. And we're very appreciative about having this firsthand introduction to the CECP. And I hope that you will also come back again, and we ask that council members who have any questions or further feedback, please do send them directly to Han, and also CC me and Valerie so that we would be able to, I think, usher those through would be helpful. Thank you, Han. So at this time, we have a few minutes to take some questions and comments from members of the public who are viewing this meeting at this time. So I'd like to open it up for that. And Valerie, I don't know if you were able to glean questions and comments from the chat coming in from the public, but we can entertain questions that way. And we can also take them through a raised hand if we're able to view. So why don't we take down this slide so that we can see each other a little better and see if there are any questions out there.
So far, we haven't had any questions in the Q&A box, and no hands are raised, so we can give it a minute.
Okay, I'll give it another few moments, and then we can just move on to our next steps. And if a question comes in, we can certainly take it.
Yeah, we have a question from Melanie Garate. So I'm going to allow Melanie to talk.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, everybody, for putting this together and allowing us all to join and meeting you all. So I'm Melanie Garate. I am the Director of Climate Engagement for the Stone Living Lab out of Boston Harbor now. I'm curious how you imagine or envision the new administration when the new governor comes in to impact this community and any environmental justice.
Well, we will, Melanie, thank you for that question, which is a difficult one to answer. We, of course, have to go through a transition in state government, and we have a number of ways in which we facilitate that transition. Institutions like the Environmental Justice Council will go on. The meat and the bread and potatoes of our work goes on, and then we await direction from the new administration in terms of things that they will prioritize.
Melanie, did you have any follow-up or an additional question before I send you back to the attendee list?
I guess my follow-up, I couldn't tell if I could still talk. The webinar function is a little confusing.
Yeah,
I suppose that, just keeping us all apprised as to all of these changes would obviously be helpful for communities. Yeah, I'm just also very curious just what's going to happen. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Melanie. I see Pat Spence's hand up. I don't know if that was from a prior question or.
before Pat asks your question, can I just read a comment that was typed in?
Absolutely.
It's quick. It's from Paula Garcia. Paula says yes to disaggregated data to track progress from the CECP. Thank you.
And Pat, did you have a comment or was?
It is more so a comment for our overall process, since we are definitely talking about equity and inclusion. And if I missed this, forgive me. We've all had our concerns trying to make the technology work as we go through this process ourselves and to be inclusive. Where do all of our elders, how do all of our elders come into this process? And no, I don't have an answer as I pose this. We in our organization, urban agriculture, et cetera, we make a point to include our elders, and it makes us go to a different space to ensure our elders are included in everything that we do. And when you look at environmental injustice, it has happened to our parents and our grandparents, et cetera. So how are we including them? I just want to make sure I bring up the topic that we're including people, because when I heard the word dashboard mentioned and things of this nature, you know, there's a whole population that they don't even, you got flip phones still. So how are they a part of this if we're talking about justice? So again, it's a bit rhetorical. I do not have an answer. I'm going to think about this myself.
Pat, you've given me an opportunity to just point out that even in a Zoom format like this, it's not ideal. What it does is it makes these meetings more accessible to a great number of people who have restrictions around mobility, people who, you know, the interpretation and language services are made easier. For the telephone, for folks who are not on Wi-Fi, don't have broadband, Zoom does have the phone-in option. It is clunky, but it does allow for people to listen in on a meeting like this, you know, where if we had solely an in-person meeting, that would be even harder to do. So I guess what I'm saying is, I appreciate you bringing up the issue around the elderly and folks who are not able to Zoom in. But I'm hoping that with the phone and other things, other resources that may make themselves available as we go forward, we'll be able to address those as well.
And I'm hoping that, but overall, beyond that, which I'm appreciative of, are we even thinking of, you know, are we thinking of our elders in this process? I just want to make sure that we're just thinking of our elders in this entire process. That's all.
Thank you for mentioning that, because that demographic, our elders do come up in a number of climate vulnerabilities and public health related concerns. So thank you for mentioning it explicitly. If there's no other questions, I'd like to move to the last items. Val, could you move on to our next slide, please? Our next meeting is scheduled for September 27th at 12 noon. Current agenda items that we're considering are as we spoke of before, the questions around what our work product will be and how to arrive at that work product, what our process will be. And a third agenda item will be an introduction to the Environmental Justice Task Force. All things going well, we will have those three items to discuss. I'd also like to receive any feedback or input about agenda items that you all have individually. Please send them in to Valerie. And I do note that many people here today asked us to have resources available so that folks can inform themselves as to EJ issues and to get on the same page in terms of what the outstanding issues are in Massachusetts right now. So if there's any other agenda items that people want to bring up now for next week, we can hear a few comments on that. If not, we can take them by email. So without seeing any hands raised or hearing anyone, Caroline, do I have to move to adjourn the hearing? To adjourn this meeting?
Rishi, before you adjourn,
Yes.
so in the Q&A box, it says
Yeah.
Namrita wants to answer a question live. Is that still the case?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
No, I was just trying to like change the notification and so.
Oh, okay, okay. But
Sorry.
it was, and no worries, it was in regards to Paula's comment that I already spoke earlier, so
Okay.
we're all good.
Okay, well,
While I have the floor, I guess one thing that I want to sort of, I guess, emphasize, and you said, thank you for making sure that there's going to be more sort of information available in advance of the next meeting. I guess I'm not sure how to sort of frame this up, but I want to make sure that the information is giving us a better sense of like, where is the current definition failing the most? Like, where is it not working? And I think one of the things I appreciated, particularly from the last meeting, was this idea, I think Lydia had mentioned it, about like over inclusion being a better sort of tactic than getting too specific and risking under including people. And so like I liked that framing that she had put together. And yeah, so I guess the main thing is like when we, as in terms of like an input to help us evolve the definition, just sort of understanding better, where is the current definition failing? Where is it not working well? And getting some data on that is an input that I'm very interested in hearing more about.
so thank you for that comment, Namrita. I think of the task of this group as actually working to clarify that question. That is one of our main tasks. There is information out there, of course. And one of the things that we'll be doing is sifting through that information and then sort of ground truthing it, I think, to see how it could affect the definition. So there will be, you know, when I get that information out, I will emphasize that as one of the focus points. So anything else? So can I open the floor to move to adjourn? Caroline, am I doing this right? Okay, good. I need a motion to adjourn, please, and a second.
This is Namrita, so moved.
Okay.
Cheryl, I second.
Okay, and then we'll have to do a roll call vote. So Kalila,
Yes.
Madeline. She's not. Melissa,
Yes.
Cheryl.
Yes.
Yes. Caroline,
Yes.
Lydia.
Yes.
Rishi,
Martha.
sorry to interrupt, but we have a person in the public who has a question, and I didn't know if we could answer it if we've adjourned. So should we allow that question?
We're about to adjourn, and we're over time. Can we ask that person to please submit that to our, on the EJ Council webpage is a link.
Okay.
Or what is the question in the
And,
Q&A?
the person raised their hand, so maybe we'll just ask if they could, if they could type the question in the Q&A box or submit it online.
I
after
think
they
let's
count.
submit it online because we're over time and we're about to adjourn.
Okay.
And we can also take it up next time if that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Apologies for interrupting.
Peter,
Yes.
Patricia, Pat,
Yes.
and Ari.
Yes.
Thank you all, and we will see you next time. And the member of the public that could not have their question answered today, please do send that in by email in the link in the EJ Council webpage. Thank you. See you next time.
Thank you.